Today, we're going to be looking at the story of Sampson, particularly the end of his life. And Sampson is also mentioned in the book of Hebrews, along with all the other heroes of the faith. And for many, this is disconcerting that there's actually a couple people in Hebrews that is disconcerting for some Christians that they would be in this chapter, which I think is something worth talking about. And so that's kind of what I want to look at today. We're going to look at it through the perspective of Samson's story, but why we find people like Sampson in Hebrews 11 and others such as Barak and Jephthah. I mean, there's a number of these names. You look at them, you think, that's interesting, right? That's not exactly who we would have probably have put there. And the Bible is interesting just in general in that way. And this is one of the, to me, this is one of the evidences, strong evidences of the authenticity of the Scriptures as a book that you can follow as a guide. When you look at many historic, quote-unquote, history books, they minimize the errors of the heroes. So if you read the story of the American independence and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, there's a lot about these people aren't generally discussed, right? You read about them and you get this picture of them, at least especially if you're talking about pre-graduate studies, you get a picture of them that's probably a bit skewed towards heroicism, right? Skewed towards ultra-romanticized history. And it's the same way when you look at pretty much any historical account. It depends what side you read it on. If you study the Alamo from the Texan side of the history, you're going to get a very different picture than if you look at it from the Mexican side, right? Same way with the Mexican War. If you look at the Mexican War from the American side of the perspective of it, you're going to get a very different idea than if you go down to Mexico and hear about the Niños Héroes and the Castillo de Chapultepec and their view of what happened. You get very different perspectives. And that's because it's been observed that history is written by the victors, and so you basically write your heroes larger than life. That's a way of promoting patriotism, nationalism, recruitment, all of these things. The Bible's not written that way. If you say how, this idea that, the Bible was written by these people who just were trying to make themselves look good. Well, they're the most pitiful writers then that have ever been. Because the heroes of the Bible don't come off looking that good. I mean, you go through and you read some of the ones that you consider to be, right, the biggest heroes of the Bible, Abraham, Moses. I mean, there are things in their lives that I'm sure that if it were written the way we would want it written of us, those things would just go away. You know, and especially after a couple thousand years, those things would just go away, and what we would have left would be this history of Abraham, Moses, Paul, Peter, all of them, that is these flawless, heroic characters. That's what we would have, but that's not what anyone is in the Bible. Their flaws are brought out. David, I mean, every single of these names we mention, what we have is a picture in our own minds of very flawed people. If we mention the name David, we immediately go to adultery, murder, treason. I mean, think about it. Almost every name in the Bible that we would mention, our mind immediately goes to the flaws, to the sins, to the faults, and to the fractures in their character, and that's because the Bible makes those so clear to us. And that is very important. It makes the Bible much more trustworthy, just on that dimension. When you read a history where the winners did nothing wrong and the losers did nothing right, that's a very suspect historical account, because that is not any type of reality that any of us have ever had any experience with. all reality that we've had experience with is that it doesn't matter who wins and who loses and who ultimately is right or wrong. Everybody has problems and faults and downfalls. Everybody. And no matter how wrong you are, everybody has some redeeming virtues, if you want to call them that. And so we find this when we get to Sampson more than anyone. I mean, he's like this prime example of this, and this is kind of how I want to look at the story of Sampson today. But let's just start in Hebrews 11:32, and it says, "And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah, of David also and Samuel and of the prophets." Now, if you notice, essentially every one of these people in this short list and this quick list are people that we would think, not too sure about them being in Hebrews 11. Even David, who had tremendous victories of faith, I mean, he has such a huge stain on his name because of the whole issue, the whole time of the whole matter of Bathsheba and Uriah and all that happened. You're thinking, maybe he would be one of those who we would just basically take down his statue, right? Kind of like what they're doing now around the South. They're like, you know what? These people, they may have been good in some areas, but they did some terrible things when it came to others, and we just want to just take those down. And basically Hebrews 11 is like Statue Hill. You have all these statues of all these people, and we would think, you know what? Let's just take the Samson one down. That's probably not one we want to emphasize. Jephthah, I don't know about that. That's a little difficult. Let's just take these down. And most of the ones in here, I mean, even Samuel, you look at it and you look at the end of his life and his kids and all that was handled and how he handled it, you're thinking, that's probably not the one we want to put right there in Hebrews 11, right? Let's just keep that back in the Old Testament. Let's just not push that up to the forefront. But here's what it says of them. It says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Here he explains what it is he's looking at and what they accomplished by faith. So we want to go through and look at this from Samson. So when we look at Samson, we see a number of things. One thing we see is a man with a very flawed character. There is just no way to get around this. Everybody in the Bible had sins. In fact, there's an interesting study you can do is go through and find everybody's sin that's mentioned in the Bible. And essentially everybody mentioned in the Bible, with the exception of Jesus Christ, who has any mention whatsoever of any extent, it tells you what their sin is. Joseph is the closest one I've found in the Bible that you get to that is essentially flawless in the Bible. He's very hard to find one on him, but pretty much everyone else, it's not even difficult. I mean, everyone, including Paul, Peter, obviously Peter, right? But even Paul, where the Holy Spirit told him, do not go to Jerusalem, and he goes anyways. Okay, when the Holy Spirit tells you not to do something and you do it anyways, okay, that's sin. So you go through and you find, well, Samson, it's really not about finding his sin, right? With Samson, it's really the opposite. You got to really look and try to find his virtue. Because it's just like page after page, Samson is the embodiment of somebody who has perfected the skill of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Like every time it looked like Samson was going to get ahead, he was going to win, he was going to finally get on track, it's like he found the way to ruin everything. It's like this was a man who had a passion for self-destruction. And you know, there's some of us who are like that, and many of us know people like that. And it's a very sad thing to see. Sad to see somebody with potential who because their character is so flawed, because their character is so damaged somehow, that they just are incapable of living the victory that they are capable of doing. And it's a sad thing to see. And when we look at Sampson, to me, that's just what you see. You see a man whose character is so fundamentally and deeply flawed that he was incapable of living in the victory that God had given him the power to achieve. And every time he went out and did something great, he felt apparently some pathology he had to counterbalance that with a horrible, horrible decision. And then you just see Sampson going through life, this inner turmoil, constant inner conflict between being the man that God had made him to be from the time he was born. This man was prepared from birth to be something, and he was fighting against that every step. Every step he was trying not to be what he was designed to be. And it's a very sad thing to look at, especially if you have anybody, if you love somebody like that, or you know somebody like that who is that way, and you see that in Sampson. It's actually pretty painful to read this. I mean, you read through and you're just thinking, Sampson, what is wrong with you? You could be the greatest Israelite of all time. Everything that the others didn't have, you have. Why would you just throw it all away? Why would you just throw it all in the trash? And for what? And you look at some of the things he's after, some of the things that are important to him, and you're thinking, why would you prefer that? And like I say, we all probably know somebody who's kind of like that, maybe a lot like that. And you look at people like that and you just think, what is wrong with these people? Well, there's obviously flaws in that type of a character. And because of that, we see tremendously squandered potential. When you look at the potential that Sampson had to rule Israel, most of the judges of Israel depended on other people. I mean, they couldn't, even Gideon, I mean, he's like, he had to have at least 300 people. And he was ready to quit when God whittled it down to that number. At that point, he's like, okay, you know, I can't go up against the Philistines with 300 men. You know, I may be a leader, but I got to be leading someone. No, Samson's a one-man wrecking crew. He's like, I don't need a nation. I don't need an army. I just need the jawbone of an ass. Just give me an old bone with a couple teeth in it. That's all I need. Bring them. Such potential that you see in this man, and yet just terribly squandered, just wasted. And you go through his life, and every step of the way is just another example of wasting your potential, wasting his potential to do something and be something. And again, you look at that and you just think, this is just so sad. And so you wonder, why would he be in Hebrews 11? How could somebody who wasted so many chances, wasted so many opportunities, he could have by himself single-handedly liberated Israel probably for all time. But he always just did just enough. I don't know if you've ever known people like that. They're so talented, they could do anything at all, and yet they just do just enough to skate by. And you see other people with very little talent, and they're working so hard trying to do something, and the people with talent, they're just not doing much at all. And you think, why is that? Yeah. Certainly not someone you're going to put in the Hall of Fame. When you look at Sampson, you also see a life of frightful consequences. Everything went bad for Sampson. I mean, if you put aside the fact that he made those choices himself, you just feel so sorry for this guy. Nothing ever works out for him. I mean, it doesn't matter what happens, it just never works out too well. He follows up great victories with terrible stinging defeats. And yes, you can say, well, it's his fault, and he made terrible choices, and he associated with all the wrong people, and he took everything too lightly, and he didn't take himself serious enough, and he didn't take the calling of God. So yes, that's all true, and yet you still can't help but still feel bad for somebody like that. Look, most of the problems that you and I have in our life are from our choices too, right? And you feel bad for yourself every day. And so when you read through, and I read through the story of Sampson, I just think, what terrible consequences. I mean, you start with, his first marriage, and then the whole thing with the foxes, and then you got, him going, and he's with Delilah, and then and you just see all these things, and the next thing you know, he's bald and blind, and he's tied to a mill like an animal, and he's just going around, and they're using him, they're throwing stuff at him, he's like a clown for everyone, and you just see all that, and you think, this is just terrible. Here's a man who was made to rule a nation. And now he's the jester in the court of the enemies. How sad. But when you look at the life of Sampson, and this is where it's difficult for us, you see exceptional faith. Now this is hard because many times we don't see that. But that's because you're not looking in the right place, or you're not looking in the right way. Exceptional faith. It's very hard to comprehend how we can say that Sampson is a study of exceptional faith. So let's talk about that for a little bit, because I think it's very important to understand this, because I think the reason why we object to Sampson being in Hebrews 11, and we object to the idea that he was a man of great faith, is because we don't understand faith very well. And I'll tell you right now that I don't think we do understand faith very well. Not just you, me, all of us. I think we don't understand it nearly as well as we ought to. I think there's a lot of confusion, a lot of misconceptions about faith. For instance, faith is not as a drop of water. What do I mean by this? You have a bathtub, and you put the little cork in the drain, and you leave the faucet dripping. Drip, drip, drip. You know what's going to happen? It'll take a long time, but it'll happen. That bathtub will fill up with water, right? With the drip, drip, drip. Well, that's how we think of faith. We think faith is like a drip of water. Starts dripping, 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 and you slowly fill up, fill up, fill up, fill up. And so each drop really isn't much. It's just a drop. But it takes a lot of drops to have a full measure of faith, right? It has to keep dripping, dripping, dripping. So all through your life, you have to keep incrementing on that. You have to keep building it up. You have to keep filling it, filling it, filling it, filling it, filling it up, so that when at the end of your life, you can say, okay, now I have faith because I've got all these drops that have accumulated, and now they've turned into this full bathtub full of faith. It's all filled up now. That isn't how faith is. That's right. Faith is like a seed, it says. Faith is like a seed. How many seeds do you need to grow an enormous tree? Just one. One tiny seed, Jesus says, will put out a huge tree, because all the power, all the life, everything that is needed to create that tree is in that one seed. Now, you need a lot of drops of water to fill a bathtub. One will not do it. I don't care how long you leave it in the bathtub, eventually it'll just evaporate. That's right. But not with seeds. And that's one of the misconceptions we have of faith. We think, well, Samson didn't have faith because he only had tiny little drops of faith throughout his life. Tiny little drops. Most of his life was not of faith, and so we add up all these drops, and we don't even get a teaspoon of faith in Samson's life. And so we think, well, that's not much faith, because look, it's very little. Well, I mean, we look at other people like Joseph or Abraham, and we say, well, they had a lot of faith, and they're always having faith, and we add up all their faith, and it's buckets and buckets of faith. But with Sampson, it's hardly anything. Every here and there and here, Jephthah, where's this great faith? We look at Jephthah and say, well, there's only one little story about him. How can he have great faith? But it's because we're looking at faith as like it's cumulative, like we have to add it up to find out what it is. It's not how faith works.
That's right,
not at all. Another thing is that faith is not of works. Now, you would think we'd understand this because it's our mantra, right? And yet I think that we have a problem with this. I think we have a certain dissonance when it comes to this. Faith is not of works. Why would you think Samson didn't have faith or doesn't belong in Hebrews 11 if it isn't because of his works? If it isn't because you look at his life and you say his works are subpar, if it isn't that, then why would you think he doesn't have faith? Well, faith is not of works. In fact, it's not even connected. You can have faith and no works. Now, we all like to go to James and say, but it says faith without works is dead. That's all true. But you need to be very careful when you read it. James is very clear about what he's talking about. And Paul makes the opposite point very clearly. He says, if Abraham was justified by works, he has whereof to glory, but not with God. James is talking about what the faith that can be seen, faith that can be appreciated, faith that can be perceived by other people, not the actual existence of faith. He's talking about the perception of faith. And that's why he says, you say you have faith and don't have works. I say I have faith and I have works. You show me your faith without works. I'll show you my faith by my works. Now that's the challenge. He's laying down the gauntlet. He's saying, okay, you have faith, I have faith. You say you can show your faith without works. I say I can show my faith by works. Let's put it to the test and we'll see who wins. Well, obviously, it's a rhetorical challenge. Obviously, the answer is if you want to show somebody your faith, you have to have works. But that isn't what Paul is talking about in Romans, and it's not what faith actually is. Faith is not the works, and it's not even connected to the works by which you can show it. These are very different things. They live on different dimensions. Faith lives on the dimension of the spiritual, and it's something that only God can see. Even people who have works don't always have faith. James's test is one that is kind of like what Mike is talking about in Sunday school. It's a model. It's close enough. It's close enough to be accurate, but it's not actually accurate because you can have works and not have faith. How do we know that? Because Jesus points out that in judgment, God will observe that. That people that thought that they had faith and everybody thought they had faith will stand before him in judgment and he will say, I never knew you. But we did great works in your name. I never knew you. And so faith and works actually are not really connected. Faith is not of works. And we read Romans 4:5. If you're looking for it, there it is. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. But look at what it says. But to him that worketh not. It doesn't say, it's not talking about people who cannot work. It is about saying relinquishing all work. One reason why people are unable to be saved, because they're not willing to not work. They're not willing to rest. This is the interesting thing about the Sabbath. And the law of the Sabbath is intended for a number of things. And one of them is to teach us a certain lesson that is very important. And that is that there is a place and a time in which God expects you to actively not work. Not coincidentally, not accidentally, right? Purposefully not work. And we know it's connected to this because in Hebrews, he connects that to salvation and says, this is not a place where work is extra. It is a place where work is not welcome. And it's very important to understand this. When it comes to faith, it isn't that works are incidental to faith. They are not welcome. You have to be that person that he mentions in Romans 4 who does not work but believes. And then your faith is counted for righteousness. It's counted for works. Faith is equated to works if you don't work. Now, we all have a hard time with that. Like I said, this is hard to comprehend because we're thinking, well, then we should go and do wrong. If we can't do right in order to exercise faith, we should go and do wrong. And that's not what the Bible teaches. In fact, that's part of the problem. You were supposed to rest from good and bad. Right? Resting from good does not mean you go do bad. I want to tell you, not only is Sampson's faith hard to comprehend, and I agree with that, but it's also impossible to deny. You say, how can that be? Well, you look at Sampson's life and all that it tells us about him. It tells us a lot about him. He's a huge figure in the Old Testament. And you tell me how he did all that without faith. I know that in the movies and in the Sunday school lessons and all the little pictures that we see, any drawing, pretty much any image I could have put up of supposedly Sampson, and we know it's Sampson because he's like, he's as wide as Albert, but he's balanced better, right? He's like turned out but upside down, right? He's this huge, massive, bodybuilder-looking guy, and he can just and it's like you look at him and you're like, okay, that's obviously how Sampson was. And yet the Bible makes it very clear that there was nothing that they could see that accounted for what he could do. They looked at him and thought, there is no way. Just send a few people, and they were constantly underestimating him because whenever they went looking for Sampson, he was just this normal-looking guy with long hair, and you're thinking, anyone can take him. My sister could take him. And yet every time they find out it's not the case. Now you tell me, how do you take a normal person who can do those things and that isn't faith? Right. This is what Hebrews is saying. Paul is saying in Hebrews that Sampson belongs here because you don't do those things without faith. It's by faith that they conquered kingdoms. It's by faith that he takes up a bone with a few teeth in the jawbone of a donkey and chases hundreds and kills 1,000. I realize we look at all the bad things he did and we think we don't want to associate that with anybody of faith. I understand that that's hard to comprehend, but we can't look at the things he accomplished and say, well, that's not faith. He didn't have faith. And this is where our problem is with works and faith. We want to look at his sins and his faults. We want to say that because faith is like a drop of water, he doesn't have enough of them to account for this. The Philistines had a similar opinion and they underestimated him every time. That's right. And as long as he believed the one thing that he had to believe, there was nothing they could do to him. Another thing about Sampson is that he is easy to identify with. Maybe one reason why we're critical of Sampson is because it deflects ourselves from being critical of ourselves. I think of all the people in the Bible that we could look at, the one that I think that most of us probably could identify the best with is Sampson. You say, well, Sampson doesn't belong in Hebrews 11. Sampson doesn't seem like a person of faith, and do you? Have you not squandered tremendous potential? I mean, we could look at this on so many levels. There are so many dimensions in which we can analyze this and just really reveal ourselves to be basically the modern equivalents of Sampson. Let's look at a couple. Let's look at one that to me is one of my personal favorites of how much potential we squander. Let's look at ourselves as economic strongmen. Each one of you in this room have greater economic potential than any generation that has ever lived in history. You are richer than anybody who's ever lived, starting from about 100 years back and back. Richer than kings. You think, I don't think so. Of course you are. In the 1800s, early 1900s, 1920, President Coolidge, I believe it was, his son died in office. While he was president, his son died from an infection he got from a blister playing tennis, because they didn't have the antibiotics that we have today. The President of the United States wasn't rich enough to save his son from a blister. You and I don't have to worry about those things.
That's right.
People died daily from food poisonings because they didn't have a refrigerator. Old people died very commonly from heat exhaustion because they didn't have AC. I'm just old enough to remember a time when our cars did not all have AC. Where ours was, the old WD-40, windows down, 40 miles an hour. It doesn't work. It's just hot air, right? It's just hot air blowing in. It's no better. I know some of you think that a fan cools the room down. It doesn't. It actually does the opposite. Look, physics is clear. You turn a fan motor on, you are not cooling anything off.
That's right.
You are generating heat.
Amen.
All right? Same reason why you can't put a window unit in the building.
That's right.
It actually will make it hotter, not cooler.
That's right.
It has to be sticking out of your house. It has to pump the heat out.
That's right.
One of my pet peeves. Turn on the ceiling fans, we're hot. It does nothing. It's a mind trick. These are not the drones you're looking for. No, we have all of these comforts. We have all of these potentials, all of this power in our life. Economically, we are incredibly powerful. You think, well, I'm very poor. No, you aren't. None of you are poor. You are incredibly wealthy. And it may not reflect in your bank account, but that's mainly because of our choices. It's mainly because of our choices. But we squander that opportunity. We don't do much with it. We can look at it in other ways. Our economic standing has led us to having tremendous health and longevity. You're going to live longer than any generation has ever lived. You're very possibly, those of you who are young here, are very possibly going to live well over 100 years old. And your life is going to be very good for almost all of it. It used to be if you lived to be 70, at 70 you were, worn out. You were this broken down old person who, just couldn't. Now you look at my in-laws. It's like they're 40. It's ridiculous. They're still talking about what career they're going to go into. We're like, at your age. You're supposed to be sitting in a recliner. No, it's amazing where you're at. And that's their generation. Your generation is even have greater potential when it comes to this.
That's right.
And look how we're squandering it. You should be living your life every minute to the fullest potential. What are you doing with your time? You're going to have more of it than any generation that has ever lived. It's going to be more valuable, more meaningful, and more potential than any generation that has ever lived. You have a greater reach and a stronger grasp than any generation who has ever lived in history. There isn't any comparison. You are able to affect and effect the entire population of the globe without leaving your living room. What are you doing with your life? We look at Samson, we should be looking at ourselves. You say, well, Samson was strong. He could go out there and just single-handedly lift enormous objects in the air. So can you. We live in a time when the smallest, frailest person can get inside one of these industrial robots and lift cars right up in the air. It's an incredible time we live in. A teenager can sit behind a joystick on a desk and a monitor and slay thousands in war. And never risk himself. We live in an amazing time. It is the potential of your life. And so when you look at Samson, you should be looking at yourself. And you think, well, Samson didn't have faith. Well, do you? I think it's easy to identify with Samson. But when we look at Samson, we see that Samson reveals a path to redemption. As I was considering this, because I was helping Terry with the Sunday school lesson on this and how to look at Samson, and I was looking at it as it was going to be preached, I thought about Samson as myself and as my children and as my siblings and as my loved ones, as each of you, and I thought, there's a lot there to be depressed about. If you say, I'm Samson, and you look at Samson's life, that's not that's going to take some real moral courage to confront that reality. And that's a good thing, but that's going to leave you in the dumps. If you really come to the idea and say, I am Samson, I have wasted my skills, I've wasted my talents, I've wasted my life, I've wasted every potential I ever had, I've squandered it all, and now what? Well, amazing thing about Samson. He's blind, he's been shorn, he's been tied to this, this mill, this old-time mill. He's walking it around in a circle. He's being mocked at, laughed at. They're having a party. They want to, let's bring Samson in so we can laugh at him. And this is his life. And he has squandered away everything good he ever had. Anything positive, anything pure, anything right. It's all gone. It's all thrown away. And they bring him in there and they tie him up to the main two columns of this huge building they're having this party in, this huge palace. And he prays out and he asks God, give me strength one more time. His hair has grown back out, which is very important, because that was what he had to believe. The hair didn't actually make him stronger. You can grow your hair out and you're still a weakling. But God had said, as long as you keep your hair uncut, I'll bless you. And as long as he didn't cut it, it was him believing God. That was his faith. Think, well, that's not very many drops of water. Nope. It's just one little seed. His hair's grown back out. He's standing there between these columns. And in faith, he says, give me one more blessing. And he pushes those columns over, and it says he killed more Philistines in his death than he did in his life. And that's how Samson went out. You think, I've wasted a lot of time in my life, and I've squandered a lot of potential. But do you have faith? You say, well, I don't think so because I've done a lot of bad things. They're not connected. I'm not telling you that your sins won't have horrible consequences. They will. But it's not connected to faith. You can still believe. And if you'll believe God and put your hands to those columns, you can redeem your life. I'm not talking about salvation. You can redeem your life. You can bring it out of the mess it was, and you can put it where it ought to be. Sure, it would have been better if we'd all done that from the time we were 4. But we're not 4. We are what we are right now. That isn't to excuse anything we've ever done. That is to say that living in those defeats is only going to produce more defeat.
That's right.
We have to, by faith, say, I'm going to believe that today can be different. I'm going to believe that God still cares about me and still will bless me to the degree that He is willing to.
Yes.
You put your hands up on those columns and you change your life. Jesus talked about this in Matthew. He said, "For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it." That's what Sampson did. Sampson finally, at the end of his life, understood. There's only one path. There's only one path to redemption. And you have to be willing to give up your life.
That's right. Amen.
Now with Sampson, that was literal or physical. He actually died with the Philistines. Now, with Jesus, it's a little different. It's the exact same idea, but it's a little different. Paul says in Romans that we reckon ourselves dead. And that Jesus says we take up our cross daily and die daily. And if you are willing to do that, you can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. You do not have to go through the rest of your life having been the person who squandered everything. You can be like Sampson, who in the end is put in Hebrews 11 with David, with Abraham, with Moses, with all of them. Why? Because he had faith. And by faith, he did not sell himself, he did not diminish himself to believe that past defeats defined what he could be. Faith defines what we can be, not works.
That's right.
Samson wasn't who he was because of what he did. Samson was who he was because of who he believed. And that's what the Bible tells us. I know whom I have believed, and that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him until that day. It is not our works. It is our faith. And that's the story of Samson. If you have any questions on this, if there's anything I have said that bothers you, you may not agree with, that's okay. Why don't you come and talk to me? I'd love to speak to any of you here who have any questions, any doubts. If there's any way I can help you or anybody here can help you, please approach us. Don't come to a Christian church, hear a sermon, and leave with questions. There's no reason for that. We are here to help you.